Amigos de ACF, the chair of Amigos de ACF, an employee resource group for Latinos at ACF. I will be your moderator for today, and really excited to kick off our celebration of the Hispanic Heritage Month. Amigos de ACF, in partnership with the ACF sponsored National Research Center on Hispanic Children and Families, is hosting this webinar, and it's entitled La Familia, a portrait of Latino children and families in the United States. As you know, Hispanic Heritage Month begins today, September 15th, and it goes all the way through October 15th. Now, this year's theme for Hispanic Heritage Month is Unidos, Inclusivity for a Stronger Nation. And in today's webinar, you will hear about the diversity and strengths of Latino Hispanic, the Latino Hispanic community, and about culturally responsive practices for serving Hispanic Latino children and families across our country. Our presenters today are Lina Guzman and Maria Ramos. Dr. Guzman is the principal investigator and director of the National Research Center on Hispanic Children and Families, where she oversees a broad research agenda, robust communication and capacity building activities, and also partners strategically with the research policy and practice community. Her research focuses on describing the characteristics and experiences of diverse communities of Latinos living in the United States to help inform policies and programs. Now, Dr. Ramos Olazagasti is a senior research scientist at Child Trends in the Hispanic Research Institute, and she leads the National Research Center on Hispanic Children and Families building capacity efforts. Her research explores how social context, exposure to adverse childhood experiences, and culturally relevant risk and protective factors influence the mental health and well-being of Latino youth and families. Before we get started, what I would like to do is to let you know that if you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to write them in the chat. Please know that I will read them at the end of the presentation so that Lina and Maria can answer. Also, you might have seen that we are recording the event today in case folks would like to see it at a later time. But I think without further ado, I will go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Guzman. And here, Dr. Guzman, please.
Thank you, Selma. And buenas tardes and buenos días to those of you who are joining us from the West Coast. We're delighted to be here today, the day that launches or kicks off Hispanic Heritage Month, to provide a portrait of Latino children and families in the U.S. But before we get started, Mariana and I would like to share a little bit about our bios. Selma shared our professional bios, but we'd like to share a little bit about our lived experience and how that has shaped the researchers that we are today. I was born in Medellin, Colombia, and my parents and I came to the US when I was 3 years old. And being an immigrant has really shaped pretty much every aspect of who I am. My first memory was the day that I came to this country. I learned English in first grade. And although my dad had a college degree in Colombia, my parents had set high expectations, I had to navigate higher ed on my own. And growing up in Queens, one of the most ethnically and linguistically diverse places in the country, also helped to turn me into a sociologist. It was hard growing up in Queens to not be asking why. Why does everyone work so hard but live in crowded housing? Why are the emergency rooms always so crowded? And why is it so different than in Manhattan? But there was also a wonderful vibrancy, entrepreneurship, and pride throughout the streets of Queens. And it's that combination of the why, what can we be doing differently, and pride that I continue to bring to the work that focuses on Latino families. And with that, I'm going to turn it over
and additionally, the landlord is using your.
Thank you, Lina, and good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. So I was born and raised in Puerto Rico, which means that I grew up in a relatively homogenous context where I was part of the dominant group. And however, that changed when I moved to New York, where both through my training in community psychology and my personal experiences, I became very much aware of how much context matters for one's well-being. In New York, I had access to many, many resources that were not available back at home. And I was exposed to many different cultures and people from different racial and ethnic groups that made me grow as a person, but I was no longer a part of the dominant group. And for the first time, I felt different. I sometimes felt like I didn't fit in, that it was harder to express myself. And I even faced some discrimination that really got under my skin at times. And all these experiences have shaped the research that I do today, which focuses on the interplay between social position, social context, and Latino youth's well-being. And now I'm going to turn it back to Lina.
Thanks, Maria. So now I'm going to share a little bit about the National Research Center on Hispanic Children and Families. The center launched in 2013, and we've been funded through two 5-year cooperative agreements from OPRE within ACF. The goal of the center is to conduct research and provide research-based information to help ACF programs and policies support low-income families. And we focus on low-income Latino families because they're a target group or part of the target group of ACF programs. Our research focuses on 3 substantive areas: poverty and economic sufficiency, early care and education, and cross-cutting themes that impact Latino child and family well-being. The center is a collaboration between Child Trends, a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization, and 3 universities, including Duke University, where our co-investigator, Lisa Janetian, is housed, University of North Carolina, Greensboro, where 2 of our co-investigators, Danielle Crosby and Julie Mendez, work, and the University of Maryland, College Park, where Natasha Cabrera works. Throughout the presentation, I'm going to be using the terms Hispanic, Latino, and Latinx interchangeably. There is no consensus in the preferred terms, and there's also regional variation, and the terms do carry different social and political meanings. And if we have time later at the Q&A, we can talk a little bit about more about what terms you should use and when. And consistent with the US Census definition, we use these terms to include individuals with family heritage that's from Mexico, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and other places in Latin America. And then just a note that the views that are represented here don't represent those of OPRE, ACF, or HHS. So as you're going to see over the next slides, the Latino population in the US is incredibly diverse. And I'm going to highlight this diversity and why understanding it matters for programs and policies by sharing 6 facts about Latino children. So number 1, numbering at 18.6 million in 2019, Latino children make up just over 1 in 4 of all children in the US today. 2, the Latino child population is geographically diverse. Latino children are no longer concentrated in a handful of states, as was the case when I was growing up. Instead, we see that in many states, in particular in the South, for example, in North Carolina or in Georgia, they've experienced rapid growth in the Latino population over the last 2 decades. And state and local governments have had to quickly adapt to meeting the needs of the Latino community. Third, the vast majority, over 93% of Latino children are US born. And although the vast majority of Latino children are US born, the immigrant experience is a reality for many. About half have a parent who's an immigrant. And fourth, as you can see here, Latino children trace their family heritage throughout Latin America. About 2/3 of Latino children in the US trace their family heritage to Mexico, just under 10% to Puerto Rico, 4% in El Salvador, and Dominican Republic and Guatemala round up the top 5 countries that Latino children have heritage in. And I note this here, not just only to highlight the diversity of the Latino population, but also because each sending country has faced different social political climates when they arrived to the US, and the push and pull factors that drove migration to the US differ, ranging for economic security or economic opportunity, political freedom, and war and violence. And each of these require different approaches to serving the community. So for example, we may need to think about trauma-informed care for those that have experienced war and violence. 5, although the vast majority of Latino children are US born, 1 in 4 have at least one unauthorized immigrant parent. And because so much of our social safety net includes restrictions on the types of benefits that immigrant families can receive, this means that for many Latino children, the social safety net is not fully accessible to them. This also means that 1 in 4 Latino children live under the real possibility of a parental deportation and possible separation of their family. And then 6, economic security is precarious for many Latino children. Just before the pandemic in 2019, 54% of Latino children, or 10.4 million Latino children, were living in or near poverty, which we define as below 200% of the federal poverty line. And 10% were living in deep poverty. These numbers here are based on the official poverty measures. And if we have time during the Q&A, I can share some of the new poverty rates for 2021 that were just released by the Census Bureau on Tuesday, I believe. So as we think about our programs and policies and how best to support Latino children and their families, it's important to remember their incredible diversity, that many Latino children experience economic insecurity, and how their family's immigration experience can shape their access to services. And finally, the ways in which programs and policies limit Latino children's access to the safety net, and consequently limit the effectiveness of social safety net programs. So now I'm going to turn to our research that highlights the strengths of Latinx children and families. Staying on the theme about economic insecurity, while we find that the experience of poverty and low income is common among Latino children, we also find that Latino parents have high levels of employment, and this is particularly true for fathers. So in this graph, on the left-hand side, we're looking here at the percentage of parents, Latino parents who are employed. The left-hand set of bars are fathers, and the right-hand side are mothers. We also break it down here by whether a parent is a US-born citizen, naturalized citizen, or non-citizens. And this last category includes those with green cards, temporary status, as well as those who are unauthorized. And we do this breakdown because access to the labor market matters, or access to the labor market differs depending on one's status. What we find is that at least when it comes to employment, it makes very little difference for fathers. The research does show that one's status does make a difference for wages, benefits, and the types of jobs that you have access to. For mothers, we see a slightly different picture, with Latina mothers who are non-citizens being less likely to be in the labor market. And now turning to family structure, which helps to shape access to resources, both economic and non-economic, like a parent's time. We find that the majority of Latino children live with 2 parents. 56%, as you can see here in the orange, live with married parents. 10% live with cohabiting parents here in turquoise, and 29% live with single parents here in purple. And about 4% live with no parent. We also have found that Latino children experience relatively high levels of stability in terms of their family structure in the early years. And this is particularly true for children who have foreign-born Latina mothers, as you can see here in the dark purple. About 65% of them experience stable family structures in the first 5 years of life. And this stability is considered a strength, as family structure can be a source of stress or protection for the family. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Maria, who's going to highlight some additional strengths of Latino parenting and talk about how we might provide culturally responsive services. Maria?
Thank you, Lena. So when it comes to parents' relationships, we see that most Latino parents perceive their co-parenting relationships as very positive. So on the left side of this graph, we present fathers and mothers' responses to questions about cooperative co-parenting. And what I mean by cooperative co-parenting is the degree to which parents support one another as parents. For example, by backing each other up in decisions about rules around how to discipline their children. And we show responses by immigrant status that we see that overall, moms and dads reported high levels of cooperative co-parenting. On the right side, we have parents' reports of co-parenting conflict, or the frequency in which they had disagreements about how to raise their children. And we see that overall, mothers and fathers' reports of co-parenting conflict are pretty low. They fall between hardly ever and sometimes having conflict around these topics across immigrant groups. And interestingly, these data come from the OPRE-funded Supporting Healthy Marriage Evaluation Study. So these are couples who are seeking relationship services. And the fact that they reported overall good quality relationships who were still seeking services signals that parents are invested in one another and in their relationships. And this is noteworthy because we know that children thrive when they grow up in low conflict and supportive environments. We also see that many Latino children benefit from very positive parenting experiences that include frequent expressions of warmth and support, which are very predictive of a lot of positive outcomes in childhood, a high level of commitment from fathers that starts even before childbirth. So research shows that dads, Latino dads report going to doctor's appointments, buying things for the baby, and are often present at the time of birth. And we see that this involvement continues later on. They report playing with their kids, reading, changing diapers, etc. And Latino fathers' engagement is important because it contributes to their children's development above and beyond mothers' contributions. Lastly, Latino parents are invested in their children's future, and they frequently engage in learning experiences like singing and telling stories that foster school readiness skills. So all in all, Latino parents engage in positive parenting behaviors that contribute to their children's well-being. And to summarize, most Latino families have the key ingredients to thrive. The average Latino parent is in a stable, low-conflict relationship and shows significant investments in their children. Programs should recognize and capitalize on the strengths of Latino families to build further competencies. So for example, the fact that fathers are present and involved in children's lives suggests that programs should include fathers in parenting programs to further bolster parenting skills and sense of efficacy. And knowing about the strengths of the Latino community and building on these strengths is important because it helps us provide culturally responsive services, which is precisely what we're going to talk about next. So given the diversity of the US population at large and the diversity within the Latino community, there's been an increased interest in and awareness of the importance of delivering culturally responsive services. And as a response to this need, the center developed a guide outlining key components for developing culturally responsive services for Latino families. And even though the guide's intended audience was primarily community-based organizations working directly with the Latino families, the 7 key components discussed are relevant for researchers and funders alike. In particular, the information is relevant to federal project officers who develop funding announcements, as these can set expectations for programs to deliver culturally responsive services that meet the needs of the community. So let's talk about what each of these involve. To start, organizations need to achieve a common understanding of what cultural competence means in their context. And definitions will vary depending on the type of services provided. The definitions usually include 3 dimensions. First is knowledge and biases of the population served. So for example, in the context of a TANF office, this means thinking about one's own beliefs about who deserves services and having a sensitivity towards the concerns that Latino populations might have about applying to TANF. It also involves developing effective communication and interpersonal skills that fosters trust in the community. And among Latino communities, this often means relying on personal connections to share information rather than just posting information online, for example. And finally, developing organizational systems and policies that are responsive to the community needs. So for example, if having a social security number is not required to receive a particular service, we shouldn't be including that information or asking for that information in application forms because it may deter certain families from applying to services. A second consideration is whether the interventions that we're adopting are effective and for whom. And the goal is always to use evidence-based interventions. There may be evidence for the effectiveness of an intervention in one population, but the intervention may need to be adapted to meet the needs of another population through translation at the very minimum, but preferably through cultural adaptation where experts in the community are involved in identifying ways to align the intervention with the characteristics and needs of the target population. A third component is conducting a needs assessment, that is, systematically gathering information about a community's need to make sure that the services provided are aligned with the needs of the community. And we often think of two types of needs assessments. Internal data collection, where we gather data from the community to assess needs and develop a plan. So for example, at the beginning of the pandemic, we spoke with several programs that serve Hispanic families about the challenges that they were facing serving families during lockdown. And they mentioned conducting needs assessments to understand how their families were faring during the pandemic. What they learned was that families were struggling to have their most basic needs met, like food or housing. So they adapted their services and formed partnerships with other community organizations to respond to those immediate needs that families were facing. A second approach is using external data. So for example, using data from the census to understand the characteristics of community members and plan accordingly. Fourth is measurement. When it comes to measurement, it's important to think about the cultural and linguistic appropriateness of the instruments used. And this goes beyond doing a simple translation. It includes asking, are we asking the right questions? Do they mean what we think they mean in the populations we're working with? For example, the term being well educated is not the same thing as being bien educado in Spanish, which is a literal translation. But in Spanish, that means being well mannered. So we could be completely missing the boat if we don't consider what that means in the community that we're working with. It also includes making sure that the measures are reliable and valid in the communities that we're using, with which we're using them. We also need to think about the method we're using to administer the measure and whether it's appropriate for that population. That is, does it make sense to collect data online? Are we asking about sensitive topics at home with other people around? Is that appropriate in this context? And lastly, we should think about any staff training that may be necessary. For example, thinking about how can we minimize bias in raters' observations? And how can we help people feel more comfortable answering sensitive questions? Fifth is collaboration. Partnerships can improve service delivery, especially when organizations bring complementary areas of expertise and are able to provide a more holistic range of services that meet the needs of the community. For example, Head Start programs often partner with community colleges and banks to provide parents with tools to further their education and plan for their financial future. In addition, partnerships with researchers can help organizations with conducting needs assessments or evaluating their services. The sixth component is workforce diversity. It's critical that the workforce represents the population served, that it includes bilingual and bicultural staff, that the organization invests in the recruitment and retention of diverse staff, and that there is training and professional development opportunities for staff in providing culturally responsive services. In other words, there should be an organizational commitment to staff diversity and infrastructure to support it. And funders can play an important role in making sure that this is the case. For example, by requiring that applications include information about staff's experience working with the community served, or any plans for providing trainings on cultural responsiveness. And finally, there's budgeting. We've talked about a lot of components that are needed to provide culturally responsive services. And these all have budget implications, as there are costs associated with adequate staffing, training, the time that it takes to build relationships with other organizations, and other costs associated with improving access to services such as translation or interpretation services. So what this means for funders is that providing culturally responsive services requires a financial investment in these services. So to summarize, delivering culturally responsive services is essential to ensure that we're honoring a community's strengths and responding to their needs. Cultural responsive services acknowledge and incorporate culture at all levels and stages. And funders play a key role in ensuring cultural responsiveness by explicitly calling for it in their funding announcements and providing adequate funding to support these activities. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lina, who's going to talk to us about some work that's coming up from the center.
Thank you, Maria. And please stay tuned because we have a question and answer period, which I'm hoping it's going to be a lively conversation. So before I turn that over to Selma to moderate the question and answer period, I'd like to share some of our upcoming work. Over the next couple of months, we're going to be releasing some briefs that are looking at the alignment or not between what's on the policy, sort of on the books, and on the ground practices at the state level for TANF and CCDF programs, and what that means for how well that facilitates access for Latino families or hinders their access. We also have briefs coming out looking at poverty and program participation among Latino families and how this varies across various features of their diversity. And we have an ongoing series that looks at how Latino families have been faring during the COVID pandemic. And then finally, we have some fact sheets that are going to be looking at access to early care and education, as well as the workforce that serves Latino families. And we have another webinar coming up. It is on October 6th. And we have here the QR code, so you can all take out your phones and easily sign up for the webinar. The webinar is going to include Julie Dowling, who's been working with the census on measuring racial and ethnic populations, and Mark Lopez, who's going to be presenting research from the Pew Research Center that looks at how that looks at different ways that we can measure and identify racial diversity within the Latino population. Next slide, please. And then please be sure to visit our website for more research and resources. We keep our website up to date. And then you can also contact us. Next slide. You can also feel free to reach out to us at our emails listed here. Visit our website and follow us on Twitter. Thank you. I think I'm going to turn it over now to Selma.
Well, thank you very much, Lina and Maria. This is such a wonderful kickoff to our Hispanic Heritage Month. I do have some questions here, and that I have prepared based on your slides and your presentation. That I really think that they would really generate a really good discussion. But I also encourage everybody to ask questions, ask away. I'm monitoring the chat over here, and I will ask the questions as soon as I see them. But in the meantime, I know that I'm going to get to the one question that someone asked. I think it was someone, Christiane. And I love that question because she asked, what do the numbers represent in the cooperative versus conflict co-parenting slides? What do the numbers represent? So what does that mean? I know that, Lina, you provided an answer, but what do you think are the implications for the work that we do here at ACF in terms of programming?
Maria, do you want me to start or do you want to start?
Well, I can start by explaining what the graph represented. So the numbers represent average responses across a number of items that ranged from 1 to 4, if I recall correctly, and where 4 was strongly agree that my partner and I are kind of aligned in how we co-parent, and lower numbers meant that they disagreed with that statement. And so higher numbers are positive insofar as they're endorsing a positive co-parenting relationship. And on the other question, lower numbers indicated that they never or Yes, never had agreements about co-parenting related topics, and or very often was the highest end. And essentially what lower numbers in the co-parenting conflict are positive. And what this means is that we have a strong foundation at home. So we have very strong families that are invested in one another, and that there is a lot of potential to build on that strong foundation to support children throughout their lives, because we see invested parents that are interested in furthering their relationship skills and getting even more support. So there's an interest in participating in programs, and they are committed to one another, and they're on the same page about how to parent their children. So they have a partner at home that's supporting them in their parenting experience. Nina, did you want to add anything?
No, I think that was a great answer.
Thank you very much, Maria. So I'm going to kind of take us back a little bit, and keep asking questions if you like. But I'm going to ask now: should we use Hispanic, Latino, or Latinx in our materials and outreach?
Yeah, I think I'll go back to part of what I said earlier, which is that there is no consensus on what is the preferred term. And we should approach it with humility and know the community and context. Context matters. So, for example, we know from Pew's research that the preferred is to be referred to, as Maria was saying, Puerto Rican or Colombian, wherever your heritage may be. But the second preferred term is Hispanic. Now, if you use that term in the Southwest, you're not going to be met with probably a lot of enthusiasm. That has that's just not a term that is used in the Southwest. In the East Coast, you can probably use it much more. So it's really knowing the context. And I also say, follow the lead of the community that you're in. Listen and then use those terms. So, for example, know your audience. If I'm in a college campus, I'm going to be using the term Latinx because that is now the term that college students are just expecting. But if I'm in the streets of Queens and Roosevelt Avenue, I'm probably going to be referring to either I'm going to be saying Latino, or I'm going to really be referring to Colombian or El Salvadorian, Puerto Rican, Dominican.
Thank you very much, Lina. So I just see a comment over here from Agda, and it says, I'm reminded how important it is to ask people how they prefer to be addressed and learn and know the context. And then there's some other comments over here. Latino sounds better and other stuff. But let's go back to another question that I think would be very, very good for us to hear your response. Let's keep talking about serving Latinos. What are some things that programs can do to increase access to social services among Latinx, Latino families, Hispanic families? How can we reduce the barriers for that access?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of research that we can build on. So we know that reducing administrative burdens for Latino communities helps. So, for example, whether it's the amount of paperwork, we don't make it easy to access our safety net. There's multiple safety net programs. Each of them have their own different application systems, eligibility criteria, recertification. So reducing any of those barriers for Latino communities in person is really helpful. So, for example, having everything completely automatic to do over online can be a barrier for Latino families. Also, the access of application materials and information, both in English and Spanish, but also increasingly in Indigenous languages. So again, as populations are emerging, especially in the South, we're seeing more and more growth in Indigenous communities of Latino, also who are Latino. So that, reducing administrative burden, simple things like asking for social security numbers. If it's not required, we know that that's a big barrier for Latino families, especially those who are of mixed status, meaning there's some US born citizens or naturalized citizens, but also some unauthorized citizens in the household. That's a big barrier, and that's, it creates fear, not just among mixed status families, but we also know that it even creates fear among naturalized households, naturalized citizen households. Maria, did you want to add anything more? Oh, and I'm sorry, I did want to say one more thing. I think we're also seeing some of the work that our colleagues, Lisa Janetian and Julie Mendez and Danielle Crosby are doing, are finding some really interesting findings from looking at some of the sort of cultural responsiveness, cultural competence scales that they are using with surveys, looking at sort of how familiar frontline administrative staff are with serving Latino communities. And we're seeing that it could also make a difference. So continual education and training, coaching and support for our frontline and administrators are, I think, can also make a big difference.
Thank you, Lena. So I see some questions here, and this one it's more of a comment, and I do want to circle back to this. I would say to this topic. So Jennifer says, I think it's also important to identify Afro-Latino, Latinas. Can you speak to the racial diversity of the Latino population, please? I know that I kind of went back from serving Latinos and now to racial and ethnic identity, but I think this is a very important also topic to cover.
Yes, it's very important to recognize the racial diversity within the Latino population. So Latinos can be white, Black, Asian, Indigenous, and we need to recognize that diversity. And it also matters we know that darker skinned Dominicans, for example, have less access to the labor market, are more likely to be poor than lighter skinned Dominican Latinos. So racial identity and the racial diversity of the Latino population is very important. I did not include that because every time we tried to pull it from the census for children, because we usually look at it from the child perspective, we're seeing that the Latino child, the racial composition of Latino children actually looks less diverse than that of their parents, which makes me not trust the data because it just doesn't hold true. It doesn't hold water given everything else that we know about Latino adults and marriage rates and who they are marrying. So it makes me not trust the data. Laura, we can pull up the data from Pew. Pew has been asking the questions about racial identity using different pictures of skin tones to help people sort of plot themselves where they think they are. What we're finding is that even if we, no matter how we ask the question, we are seeing that still the majority of Latinos identify as white. And a small percentage, as you can see here, identify either as Black or in the middle. So we're seeing that no matter how we're asking the question, we're just not getting the racial diversity in our survey instruments that I think that we would anticipate. It also matters, what sort of heritage we're looking at. So for example, Afro-Cubans are a much bigger portion of the Cuban population now than they were in the 60s or 70s, for example.
Yeah, thank you, Lena. I don't know, Maria, if you wanted to add to that answer. If you don't, it's okay.
I just wanted to put a plug again for the webinar that we're hosting later during Hispanic Heritage Month. That's going to be surrounding the topic of how to conceptualize race among Latinos, because it's a question that it always causes pause as a Latino when you're asked about your race. And it changes over time. I remember initially when I moved to the States, I always selected white. And if you go back to a couple of censuses ago, in Puerto Rico, the vast majority, like 90% of people selected white, where I'm sure that other people don't perceive most people in Puerto Rico as white. And now I don't know how to answer that question. So we're going to be talking precisely about conceptual issues surrounding racial identity around Hispanics and considerations for how to ask this and potentially change the way the census is asking this question, which has implications for other surveys as well.
Yeah, I think, Claudia, I saw a comment here. From my understanding, Hispanic was used to address people who speak Spanish, which encompasses Latinx community, as well as those who are from Spain. And so using the term may not always exclusively address those whose origins come from Latin America. That's kind of goes along with our previous conversation. And then also, I think what I would like us to, I know that there was another, I'm trying to keep up with the comments over here. I know that there was another comment here from Hasrael. He says, it makes a difference also when you use in Spanish or in English to some. And I think that that's also the case. I think people are agreeing that there's different ways to address the community. One of the things in my personal experience, I would say that when I answer the census, I don't know what to say because I don't identify as white. I identify as indigenous to Latin America, but there's really no place for me to put myself there. So I just say other, and if that's a choice. But I do think that a lot of, like you were saying, Maria, that some of this really stems from the social, perception of colorism, and where, the lighter skin you are, the better off you are in Latin America. And so I think that that would create an impetus for people to identify as such, even though they may not see themselves really completely like that. But, again, that's a very dynamic discussion that we can have at another time. But I really appreciate, all these comments and also all these questions. For the sake of time, and I'm trying to really keep up with the questions, what I wanted to do is also ask another question related to serving Latinos. And maybe we have kind of touched this already, but how important do you think it is to be aware of the family heritage of Hispanic children and families in the programs that we serve? Are there differences in the data and how you would serve them based on their heritage? Is that something that programs should consider in the outreach activities? I think there's a lot in that question, but if you can unpack it, that'd be great.
Yeah, I can start, and I'm sure that Maria is going to want to chime in as well. And first, I just want to say how much it warms my heart to see 200 people, taking part in this webinar. It really it makes me so happy, and just a lively conversation. So I'm going to go back to some of what I said earlier. I think it is important to understand their context and their history. So for example, if you're providing services to unaccompanied minor children, recent arrivals, for example, you need to know about why, why they might have, first, number one, that the experience that they had coming to this country probably was very traumatic. Being alone from parents also is a very traumatic experience, and also the reasons that they may have come. So understanding that, you can better serve them. For example, if you're, serving communities that have had recent war or violence, and that is the reasons that they came to this country, trauma-informed care is going to be really important. It goes back to what Maria was saying. When the pandemic happened, and many of the communities that were, for example, providing fatherhood or parenting programs, they had to take a step back and say, I can't start even doing that or thinking about that, and my families are not even ready for me to do that until the food is on the table. They know that they have enough money coming in so that they're not going to be evicted. There's just sort of primary needs that need to be met first before other services can be provided. So really knowing your community, I think, is really helps you to better serve your family. Your families, yeah. Maria?
I was just going to add that also it helps you know a little bit about default eligibility. For example, Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens at birth, so they are in the U.S. Eligible to most, if not, I think all services that we're thinking about right now. In Puerto Rico, the difference is, it's complicated, but that's a distinction between people from Puerto Rico and people from other Latin American countries that can, knowing that is important in terms of offering services to families.
Great, great. I'm noticing that there's a lot of nods, a lot of applause for the points that you guys are making. So thank you very much. Keep bringing in not only the applauses and the thank yous and all that, but also questions if you have any other questions. I do have someone here, and I'm not sure. I think it's a very interesting personal experience, and I'm going to read it unless Elizabeth tells me not to. But it says, I identify as Hispanic because of my heritage, but I was not given the language due to choices made by my grandparents, who felt it was best to assimilate in the Irish Italian community in New York City back in the 1930s. They were the only Hispanic family in their neighborhood, so they felt it best not to speak to their children in Spanish. With that said, does this mean I cannot embrace my Hispanic heritage?
Absolutely not. I mean, you absolutely should and can. I will say that this is an experience that it happened to many. It happened to my husband and my husband's father. He too, sort of the language got cut off and the heritage got cut off because they felt the need to assimilate, because it was being, the pressure to assimilate, because they were the only ones living in Illinois back in the 50s and 60s. I had a very different experience because I was in Queens in the 70s and 80s, and there was just a huge, vibrant community. So I didn't know that you couldn't get arepas, and I had Colombian restaurants all around me, so I could really take part in that. That was able to stay alive in my household, and we didn't feel that pressure. But definitely when I moved into Wisconsin and other parts of the country, I'm like, oh, that's, I have to be very conscious to keep that alive. But absolutely, it can be embraced and should be, and celebrated. Yeah. Maria, did you want to say anything else?
Absolutely, yes. You're Hispanic if you say you are, is what I think. So.
Okay, so everybody is agreeing and sending hearts and saying yes. Yes, if you identify as Hispanic, you are Hispanic. Let me shift gears here for the last, I would say, 5 minutes, just because I do think that there are some things that I would love to touch on. I think there were some good news in the poverty data that you presented. Earlier, you mentioned new data from the census on child poverty rates in 2021. Can you tell us what they found first?
Yeah.
And then you can just report a little bit, or tell us a little bit about the declines in child poverty to the extent that it had declined for Latinos.
Yeah, it was a very exciting week for those of us who care very much about child poverty, which I think is and the well-being of children, which I think is everybody on this call here. So the census released on Tuesday, I believe, fresh data or new data for 2021 that looks at poverty rates and found that poverty rates using supplemental poverty measures. So those are the ones, that's the measure that allows us to include all the different types of safety net programs, federal programs in our poverty measures. And what they found is that the percentage of children, Latino children, declined from 23% in 2020 and to 22% for Latino children in 2021. And this was the case across all racial ethnic groups. I'm sorry, that was the official poverty measure. Sorry, I'm looking at my notes. And for the supplemental poverty measure for Latino children, it went from 14.7 in 2020 to 8.4 in 2021. And a good chunk of that is, attributable to all of the continued stimulus payments that were made, but in particular, the expanded child tax credit that was temporary between July and December of last year, and then a final lump payment through taxes in 2022. So what this really shows is that, number one, we can, and we do have the tools to reduce and possibly even eliminate child poverty. And we know how to do this, and we know how to do this well. And when we have policies that center the child and make and really help to take away a lot of the administrative burden. So for example, the child tax credits came to your, if you had a bank account and the IRS knew about you and you had filed taxes, it went to your account. And that also allowed then the IRS to really focus their efforts and their outreach efforts on those that were not necessarily as easily reached through, you know, sort of the easy ways. I can get on my soapbox about this, but I know we have other questions.
No, Lena, you probably saw me smiling because I'm also managing the chat over here, and I saw something that I want to leave us with when we do leave ourselves. But thank you for that, Maria. I don't know if you wanted to touch on anything else before I go and move on to the next question.
No, you can.
I did want to put in a plug. We also, Child Trends also released a poverty report that looked at trends over the last quarter century, and we also found incredible, you know, reasons to celebrate that child poverty has declined over the last roughly 25 years. And I'm going to put in a plug. We have a webinar coming up also, I believe possibly the same date. Oh no, October 12th. Good. I was worried that it was October 6th. And that's another one to make it easy. Everybody could take out their phones and sign up for that webinar to learn more about, you know, what led to this, you know, really historic decline of just over 50% of child poverty, reducing in 20 years.
Great, great. Yeah, thank you. Very exciting. So the last question, you showed that Latino fathers have high levels of employment, and this is kind of going, you know, along with the poverty theme here. You showed that Latino fathers have high levels of employment. What are the implications of that finding for economic self-sufficiency programs?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what we're seeing is that, in fact, yes, Latino fathers have high levels of employment. And we also see that poverty and low income among Latino children looks a little different than it does among Black or white children. And part of that is because its income is much more stable. And the reason, the source of that stability is employment. So the experience may look differently, but and it may be a more stable low income or low poverty. But what we're also seeing is that there's not the avenues for mobility. And mobility and thriving economically are you know, and poverty are very different. So you know, it also has implications for employment training programs, so providing the tools for parents to not only be able to have a minimum wage, or, you know, but also to be able to really sort of start to be able to climb up the ladder of economic mobility. And it also means, you know, wealth. It means the inability to accumulate wealth for the next generation, and we know that that has really important implications. Great.
Maria, anything that you would like to add before I move on to maybe one of the things that I saw, and I was trying to look for it again. There's a lot of chatting going on. Someone said, I speak in English, but I feel in Spanish. And I love that. I'm sorry that I lost the name of the person who wrote that in, but that definitely, I think I can identify that with that. And you know, thank you very much for putting that in. Well, with that, I really want to thank our presenters, Dr. Ramos Olasagasti and Dr. Guzman. I can't say doctor and then say the last names, you know, in Spanish. It just feels really weird for my brain. But I really thank you very much for the time and for all the information that you have shared today. I think that we would love to invite you back at some point for us to continue the conversation. I feel like there's a lot of interest, and I truly have enjoyed our conversation here, and also the interest that I see. And so what I would like to do before we go, I want to remind the audience that there's going to be other Hispanic Heritage Month events that ACF has been planning. The next one will be on Wednesday, September 21st. And in that one, it's going to start at 1 p.m. And that will include our Assistant Secretary, the one and only Assistant Secretary Contreras. And so I very much look forward to seeing you there. Unless you, Maria or Lina, have any departing words, I think that we can adjourn. And I really thank everybody for their time, their questions, their excitement, and their positive comments. Well, positive, we would welcome any kind of comment, but in that case, they have been positive. So thank you so much, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you,
for having us.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.